Tonight, we are looking at one of those moments when a war that feels far away suddenly reaches out and puts its hand directly on the shoulder of the United States. This story starts with a missile strike in Ukraine, but it doesn't stay there. It lands on the desk of the President of the United States. It shakes the walls at the Pentagon, and it forces Washington to answer a question that has been hanging over this war since the very first day. How far are we really willing to go when Russia says stop or else? Here's what we know. In the last 48 hours, Ukraine carried out a high-profile strike on Russian forces based in occupied territory. The kind of strike that Moscow cannot pretend didn't happen and cannot shrug off as a small tactical setback. This was not a random artillery duel on some muddy trench line in the Donbass. This was a strike on a target that Russia claims as its own and that the world recognizes as illegally occupied. Russian military infrastructure deep in territory Russia has been using as a sanctuary for its war machine. Territory like Crimea or the air bases and depots that feed the campaign against Ukrainian cities. And according to Russian officials, that strike was carried out with Western-supplied weapons, long-range missiles that Washington signed off on, weapons specifically capable of hitting the very assets Moscow thought were safely behind the front. In response, the Kremlin did something very deliberate and very public. They summoned the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. You don't do that by accident. You do that when you want to send a message not just to Washington, but to the rest of the world. And they issued what they described as a harsh warning to the United States. Russian officials spoke of consequences, of crossing red lines, of the U.S. being directly responsible for the deaths and damage from this strike because these were American-made weapons hitting what Russia is calling its own territory. That language is not new, but the tone, the emphasis, the theatrics of the summons, the cameras outside the foreign ministry. This is Moscow choosing escalation in the diplomatic arena to underscore that it sees this as a test case. Now, when Russia does something like that, it's not just theater. A formal diplomatic summons with the ambassador effectively called onto the carpet and lectured for his country's actions is the last step before you start talking about expelling diplomats, cutting off channels, or worse. And what Russia is trying to do here is very specific. Detach the United States from Ukraine. They want to rewrite the narrative from Ukraine is defending itself against an illegal invasion to the United States is attacking Russia by proxy. Once they do that, they can claim that any retaliation, cyber, military, hybrid attacks, sabotage is not part of the war in Ukraine, but part of some bigger clash with the West, which they hope will scare American voters, scare European capitals, and fracture support for Kiev. This is information warfare and diplomacy wrapped around a battlefield event. Washington, though, did not respond by pretending this didn't happen. Inside the administration, there was an immediate scramble. Secure video conferences between the White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, and U.S. commanders in Europe. Intelligence briefers laid out exactly what they believed had happened in the strike, what was targeted, what kind of missile was used, whether there were any U.S. personnel anywhere near the site, how much of the Russian narrative lined up with independent satellite imagery and signals intelligence, and what Moscow might be preparing as a follow-on move. This is always the first question behind the scenes. Is this just rhetorical escalation, or are we seeing troop movements, missile deployments, cyber probing that suggest Russia is pairing its angry statement with something more concrete? At the same time, the State Department had to decide, do we downplay this or do we answer it head on? And the decision, judging by the language we've now heard publicly, was to answer it head on but carefully. The U.S. line has essentially been, yes, the United States gives Ukraine the means to defend itself. Yes, we support Ukraine's right to strike legitimate military targets used to kill Ukrainian civilians. No, that does not make America a direct combatant in the war. Washington reiterated again that it does not encourage or support attacks on internationally recognized Russian territory, that it believes in avoiding uncontrolled escalation, and that Russia is the one violating international law by occupying Ukrainian land and launching missile and drone attacks on cities, power grids, and apartment buildings. But here's the harder, quieter thing that Washington has to do after a warning like this. It has to talk to allies behind closed doors, and it has to talk to Ukraine. Because if Russia is now openly threatening Consequences for a strike that used Western-supplied long-range weapons that goes directly to the heart of the coalition's strategy for 2025 and beyond. Ukraine's ability to survive this war depends in part on taking away Russia's sanctuary, those airfields, depots, command posts, and logistics hubs that sit comfortably behind the front lines and pump missiles and bombs into Ukrainian cities. Ukraine cannot meaningfully defend itself if it is required to only fight with one hand tied behind its back, limited to the immediate front line, while Russia launches from deep inside occupied territory. So Washington and European capitals have been inching closer to giving Kyiv precisely the tools that Moscow is now protesting so loudly. This is where the domestic politics in the United States crash into the strategy in Ukraine. You have a war-weary American public watching another winter of blackouts in Ukrainian cities, watching debates in Congress over aid, watching a President Trump, telling voters that Europe should do more, that Ukraine should accept a deal, that the U.S. is carrying too much of the burden. TIME. And at the same time, you have a bipartisan core in Congress, national security officials across 3 administrations, and almost every major U.S. ally insisting that if you let Russia dictate the terms of this war by threatening escalation every time Ukraine gets stronger, you're not avoiding escalation. You're rewarding it. You're teaching the Kremlin that nuclear saber rattling and harsh warnings work. So when Russia sends a harsh warning to the U.S. after this latest Ukrainian strike, Washington is not just responding with talking points. It is making choices that will echo for years. One option is to quietly pull back, tighten the leash on how Ukraine can use U.S. weapons, rewrite agreements so that Kyiv has to get explicit case-by-case approval for certain targets, maybe slow-walk future deliveries of long-range systems. That would lower the temperature with Moscow in the short term. It would also, frankly, tell the Kremlin that its strategy worked, that threatening consequences for a Ukrainian attack on an airbase or a command center can actually change U.S. policy. The other option is to hold the line or even step it up, to make clear that as long as Russia is launching missiles from a base, that base is a legitimate military target, even if it's in occupied territory Russia claims as its own. To say that if Ukraine wants to survive, it has the right to cut off the arms that are trying to kill it. That doesn't mean Washington will sign off on everything. Every administration draws its own quiet red lines. But it does mean refusing to let the Kremlin define what is allowed and what is not. Judging by the early reaction we have seen, the public insistence that U.S. support will continue, the reassurance to allies that nothing has changed in principle, and the calm, measured language about Russia's threats, it looks, at least for now, like Washington is trying to walk that second path, not backing down, not matching Russia's rhetoric, but not letting it dictate the rules either. Now, there's another layer to this that we have to talk about because it's easy to get lost in the immediate drama and miss the structural shift underneath. For months, Russia has been escalating its own campaign, launching wave after wave of missiles and drones at Ukraine's energy system, civilian apartment blocks, and critical infrastructure. Those attacks are not only killing civilians, they are designed to break the morale of the Ukrainian population, to freeze the country into submission, and to send a message to the West. You can't protect your ally. In that context, Ukraine's strike on a key Russian military site is not some random escalation. It is part of a broader effort to push the costs of this war back onto the aggressor, to show Russia that there is a price to be paid for waging a campaign of terror from what it thinks is a safe distance. Russia's harsh warning, then, is not about some abstract principle. It is about their fear that Western support is finally making that strategy work. And here's where Washington's response really matters, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for every country watching this from the sidelines. Countries like China, Iran, North Korea, and every would-be aggressor calculating whether military force can get them what they want. If the message coming out of Washington is, we will support you until the other guy gets really mad, and then we'll reassess, that is a very different world than one where the message is, we won't be bullied out of defending our allies and the basic rules of the international system. The stakes here are not just about one airbase, one missile, or even one war. They are about whether armed aggression, once launched, can be managed by threats alone. Inside Ukraine tonight, this debate looks very different. They are not parsing diplomatic language. They are sitting in the dark because another power plant has been hit. They are standing in line for water because yet another substation has been destroyed. They are mourning people killed in apartment buildings, in trolley buses, in city centers struck in broad daylight. Reuters. For them, the question is brutally simple. Will the West give them not only the weapons, but also the political permission to hit back in a way that might actually change Russia's calculus? Or will every effective strike be followed by a panicked meeting in Washington where the main concern is not how to stop the next Russian attack, but how to keep Moscow from getting too angry? So when we say Russia sends harsh warning to U.S. after Ukraine strike, Washington responds, what we are really watching is a test. Not a test of who can shout the loudest, but a test of whether the United States and its allies believe their own arguments about why this war matters. If we say that borders can't be changed by force, then we have to accept that helping Ukraine actually resist that force will anger the aggressor. If we say that civilians shouldn't be targeted, then we have to accept that striking the bases and airfields from which those attacks are launched is legitimate self-defense. If we say that smaller countries shouldn't be left alone to face nuclear-armed bullies, then we have to accept that nuclear-armed bullies are going to issue threats when they feel their leverage slipping away. Tonight, Moscow has done what it so often does. It has tried to turn the story from its own aggression to its own victimhood, from Russia launched another missile attack to Russia is being attacked by the West. Washington's response will determine whether that narrative takes hold. If the United States stays steady, if it keeps backing Ukraine's right to defend itself, keeps coordinating with allies, keeps its own rhetoric calm but firm, then Russia's harsh warning will look in hindsight like what it is, a sign that the strategy of helping Ukraine reach deeper into the aggressor's war machine is working. If Washington flinches, if aid is quietly narrowed or delayed, if rules of engagement are tightened every time the Kremlin raises its voice, then this moment will be remembered very differently, as the night Russia learned that threatening consequences was enough to bend American policy.